We're back with Mr. Sivaraman today in part 2 of Casey's View Spot, as the first part had to be drastically cut short due to a technical problem. Thank you, Mr. Sivaraman, for the patience shown and for appearing again.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to have been interviewed last time.
The theme is current issues, and let's go straight to the questions I have with me here. While it's not even 100 days over since the present BJP government under Prime Minister Modi has begun its administration, how would you rate its performance so far?
For a government that has been in power for almost 100 days, I think they have started out well.
Okay.
At least as far as the public is concerned, they have done away with the requirement of affidavits.
Okay.
This was a big stumbling block for many people, and poor people had to pay a lot to get an affidavit soon. Now that self-certification has been accepted as a legal document, at least by government order, I think this has given a big relief. Secondly, they are doing away with certain other things also which will shortly be coming in. Only yesterday in the papers I found that a number of laws in existence which have outlived their utility, they are all going to be scrapped. This has been going on for a number of years, but nobody had done anything. But I think Mr. Modi has announced he is going to do the thing. Similarly, there may be many other small changes which they might have made, which we really do not know, but when we start getting to the practicality of it, we will come to know of it. The budget has announced various measures, like for example, an e-platform through which an industrialist can apply for various clearances through one window. And within a few days, they are supposed to get back the replies or any queries or any clarification they think for, and within a month, their clearances will be given. As it is, the Department of Environment has delegated powers to the state governments, or at least in the process of delegating powers to state government for all Government of India's activities, state government activities, ministries' activities, etc. Whereas earlier they had to go to the Government of India Ministry of Environment for many of these things. So many changes are coming up, which I hope will considerably ease the process of administration in the country. Now the latest one is the commandments, or rather 19 commandments that the Modi government has issued to the civil servants as to how they should behave and how they should discharge their responsibilities, and at the same time he has assured them protection. One important thing which I think he missed out is that while he has stated that civil servants should not accept any gifts, etc., in my opinion, civil servants should not meet with any industrialists or anybody inside their offices, personal offices. They should meet with them in an open room where the proceedings should be televised and also video recorded for any future reference. Because all these complications which have come up recently in regard to people meeting, giving this benefit, that benefit, will not arise at all. I have travelled across Europe. I have visited almost all the government headquarters in the entire European Union, even in the United States. I haven't found hundreds of people loitering around, entering secretary's room, joint secretary's room, troubling them, getting to know the secrets of the government, copying files, as many media people flash papers across the screen. This is what so-and-so has written, this is what... This you can't see anywhere in Europe. This should be stopped. People should, if they want to meet with the officer, they should fix a date and they should meet them in a common room. They should not meet in the offices of the concerned officers. Like for example, in Tamil Nadu, the collectors have been asked to meet the public on a particular day in a week, where they are supposed to take applications and settle the grievances. Something like this can start, and probably he will do that. And by and large, I think many of the announcements that he has made in the budget, the Prime Minister issued a directive that they should all be implemented before the close of December.
You've suggested a very good change, and if it comes about, it's really radical. I don't know where it will come about, but I hope it does at some point.
In my 14 years in Government of India, I never attended a party given by any industrialist or any businessman.
So, I wish there were more officers like you. Center-state relations is something that has been evolving so far. How do you see the center-state relations under the Modi administration, especially as compared to the previous UPA-led government?
I think Mr. Modi has made it very clear that if the central government has to run successfully, it has to take along with it all the chief ministers and keep them on the right side. you cannot have a confrontationalist approach to the state government from the center. Because it is the state government which implements programs, and they are the people who are down to earth and who are in direct contact with the people. Therefore, the central government has to keep the state governments on the right side, and similarly, the state governments will also have to respect the central government, because after all, it is a government which gives internal security, which also provides external protection, which also maintains relationship with other countries, and which also raises resources. 33% of it goes to the state government. So they have to respect the central government and its policies, not keep on challenging it at every nook and corner. Like Mr. Chandrasekhar Rao yesterday called the Prime Minister fascist. It's in extreme bad taste. It's in very poor taste that he has called the Prime Minister of this country a fascist without knowing what he's talking about.
You did cover this question to a certain extent last time, but given the centre's decision which came after that on the aptitude test in English for the civil services exams, what do you think will be the repercussions of such an issue?
I think the government of India should not have intervened in whatever the UPSC considers as the best. The Union Public Service is a constitutional authority, and therefore the government of India should not intervene. From the newspaper it appears, even whatever the government of India suggested, the UPSS and entire commission has rejected their suggestion. Because you should not dance to the tunes of students who are behaving like gundas in the streets, burning buses. And are these the people who are going to become district magistrates or Indian Police Service officer to maintain law and order and to maintain the internal security of India? Or are they going to become the chelas of Dawood Ibrahim? So this is absolutely, very, very disturbing. That these are the people who want to aspire to become district magistrates and secretaries to government of India, secretaries to state government, implement policies and go with the poor, people who burn buses. This is not the thing, and government of India should put its foot down. Even if it comes to the stage of scrapping the entire All India services, they should not allow gundas to get it. And they should not dictate terms as to how the examination should be conducted.
So, does the UPSC have powers to conduct the examination without following the orders of the government?
No, there is no need for them to follow the orders of the government of India. Unless the government of India enacts a legislation which is making it compulsorily on the UPSC to follow it. Otherwise, UPSC conducts its own examination. Otherwise, why are they given constitutional status to the body?
Okay, thank you. There's been a lot of publicity given in TV channels recently on ornamental MPs who are celebrities and icons like Rekha and Sachin Tendulkar, who have been given Rajya Sabha seats. And their attendance and performance there has been very poor so far. Given that we are a country of 1.2 billion people, isn't it imperative that we select only people who are willing to give their time and expertise for legislating on important issues concerning every citizen?
Yeah, that's right. You see, unfortunately, I think this nominated MPs have become political appendages. And every time a political party comes to power, it's a kind of, either giving some kind of prerogatives or honors to people who have served them, or they are being merely used as mere political tools. Nomination means they could have nominated eminent jurists who do not want to contest the elections, eminent doctors who do not want to contest elections, eminent lawyers who do not want to contest elections, eminent civil servants who just do not want to go in near politics. But still, they could have been useful, or eminent army officers, generals, or Air Force, Air Marshals. These are the people they could have nominated, not film actors and actresses and people who play cricket or football and all. They don't have any time. They are from their own busy schedule. There is no point in unnecessarily blaming them also, because they are not fit for this kind of a job.
Every so often we have communal riots. Given that India is a country of various ethnicities, communities, religions, who have been coexisting for centuries, would you say that these riots are manufactured?
See, sometimes riots are instantaneous. When once they are instantaneous, two people clash, or there is some kind of communal difference of opinion on a particular issue, it is not necessary that the politicians get involved in it immediately, because I have handled many communal riots, and I have never seen politicians getting involved in it in the beginning. But later on, politicians are likely to utilize that opportunity for purposes of settling their own scores or gaining an advantage or one-upmanship. Now, I don't think, as far as Uttar Pradesh is concerned, they are quoting all kinds of numbers, and one does not know whether the numbers are correct or not correct, and they are trying to probably utilize it as an attack on the present government, and it's not clear. But you must also understand the fact that it is the state government which is responsible for maintaining communal peace, and not even the state government, it is the district magistrate. Time and again, Government of India as well as the state governments all over the country have emphasized it is a responsibility and fundamental duty of the district magistrate and the superintendent of police to maintain communal harmony and communal peace in his or her district. And for that, he or she need not take any orders from anybody. If it comes to a question of communal peace, he shall maintain the law. Because the district magistrate and superintendent of police are so powerful, they need not take any assistance from anybody, excepting when a situation happens and they have to call in the armed forces. Even for that, the district magistrate is competent to call the armed forces to maintain peace. So by and large, I would feel it is a failure of the district magistrate and superintendent of police to maintain communal harmony, rather than the politicians starting the fracas.
So given the prevalent Middle East situation, what advice would you give Indian citizens already working there or wanting to work there?
Now, as far as Indians are concerned, they have taken a risk. They have gone out for purpose of taking out a livelihood, to improve their chances of accumulating wealth when they come back. So everyone knows there is a risk element involved in it. And if situations go out of control, the government is always there to help their own citizens who are working and who are sending a lot of money to this country. India is one of the largest recipient of remittances, which is keeping us afloat as far as the external sector is concerned. Therefore, Indian government should also play a major role in providing assistance to them and rescuing them if they are in difficulties. I don't think we should stop them, but whenever there is trouble brewing, Government of India's missions abroad should be ready to help them.
Now, Ebola has been in the news because of the many deaths in Africa associated with the disease, as also Westerners who have contracted it and are being treated for it in the USA and Spain, for instance. Given that traveling across the world has become so easy, is it just a matter of time before we see Ebola's appearance in India? And if so, do we have the infrastructure and facilities to handle it?
No, as far as anybody coming in with an infection, I don't think we can clearly say that we can prevent it, or there are enough measures put in place which will stop anybody infected coming in. Because even the United States, a couple of people infected have been taken to the United States for purpose of treatment. Spain has taken a person for treatment. So we cannot avoid, if anybody comes into India and he has got this virus, we cannot avoid taking them into our hospitals. Many hospitals in the country have got a separate infectious diseases ward. Some of them are in awful conditions. Some of them may be in very good condition. We have got excellent doctors, excellent research labs, excellent nursing personnel, and hospitals. Our hospitals are very good. Some of them are world class. And if the government wants to really utilize them, they can always utilize them for purpose of tackling any emergency. I think we have enough resources and enough capability of handling any such emergency, provided the government is determined to ensure that all the resources available in the country are mobilized and put to proper use.
In this connection, do we need more hospitals and more doctors?
We have enough hospitals. For example, almost every district has got several primary health centers, several community health centers, district hospitals are there. Some of them are very large, medical colleges are there. Recently, before the last government went out of office, they sanctioned some 58 new medical colleges. Private medical colleges are coming up. I won't say that we have enough of them, but we are reasonably provided with hospital facilities if there is an emergency like this.
Now, coming to an entirely different topic, ISIS has overtaken the Al-Qaeda as being the #1 terrorist organization. Given the atrocities being committed on minorities and other communities, do you think the US airstrikes and airdrops are a little too late? How far they, that is the ISIS, a threat to Indian interests?
First of all, we do not know what is the relationship between ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
ISIS may be a probably rebirth of Al-Qaeda itself.
Okay.
And these are all small groups that are combined together with some kind of a religious notion. They should set up a Islamic caliphate, which probably went out of existence some 400 years ago.
Okay.
And secondly, there is always this divide in Islam itself. Major divide of Shia and Sunni. There are so many subsets as we have in Hinduism also. So all these things will not permit any one particular group to be a dominant force in the entire world, which was there in existence before the 16th or 15th century.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the American response is concerned, the Americans were criticized and condemned, and to an extent probably rightfully so, that they invaded Iraq when they didn't have really any substantial reasons to invade Iraq. And after 10 years they left Iraq, and now democracy or whatever it is, a semblance of democracy is there. And that democratic prime minister probably did not take into confidence the other dominant Islamic community, Sunni, into their fold, and therefore he is having a trouble in his hands. Now, at present, the United States has re-entered Iraq. Why? Because there are minorities, Yazidis, who have been trapped on a mountain, and they have been surrounded by ISIS forces. They are unarmed. They don't have any sustenance. So in my opinion, the United States has done very well for purpose of protecting those minorities, to take them out of trouble, to give them food. And if I had anything to do with government of India, I would have strongly advised, not in terms of armed intervention as far as this is concerned, but in terms of providing relief to the people who have been completely surrounded and whom they don't want to starve to death.
Yeah.
So unless these kinds of actions are taken, what for are we a nation?
Okay.
And unless we go to help large masses of people in distress, and where a genocide is about to take place, if we do not show our strength, from our point of view, I'm saying, nobody has approached India so far.
Yeah.
If anybody approaches India, we should, in all humility, I would say, that government of India should intervene, providing them food, clothing, water, whatever required. May not be an armed intervention, but other assistance government of India should also do, which I would praise United States for having taken this action.
But do you think the United States can do anything much, given that the President Obama keeps saying that no ground troops will be involved?
No, ground troops he doesn't want to send in because there is tremendous amount of pressure against him. And secondly, they are going to face elections in November. Congress is going to go to polls, and thereafter they'll start preparing for the presidential polls. Of course, Obama will be out. And as far as ground troop intervention is concerned, I think it is probably highly improper for him to do it. It should not be done. And regarding the humanitarian mission and to prevent people from getting massacred, his intervention in the form of drone strikes and Air Force strikes should be supported.
What is your take on Indo-Pak and Indo-Sri Lankan relations?
Yeah, as far as Indo-Sri Lankan relations is concerned, in my opinion, it has been highly politicalized as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned.
Okay.
If you ask for a general opinion of an ordinary Tamilian going on the street, you wouldn't even care what is happening.
Okay.
Have they ever cared for anything that happened in Singapore? No, because the Singapore government is very strong.
Yeah.
They put a lot of people behind bars. 72 people are still in jail, or 70, 80 people in jail. Tamilian population is there in Malaysia. Some of them go to jail for various crimes they commit. So, as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, it is simply being used as a political instrumentality.
Okay.
I don't think either of the chief ministers have ever gone to Sri Lanka, visited and hobnobbed with the Tamils there and talked to them about what their difficulties are or anything. I don't think so they have done. And what is the point in saying all these things? Yes. From the point of view of Tamil Nadu, if there are refugees coming in from Sri Lanka, then Tamil Nadu is affected. To that extent, they can raise a voice of protest to the government of India, which is constitutionally under obligation to take it up with any other external country or external power. And it is not for the government of Tamil Nadu or any other state government for that matter to pass a resolution in the Legislative Assembly against the government of India. It is not within the legislative competence to do that. It is incorrect. Because then what happens? Tomorrow the government of India, some people will pass a resolution against Tamil Nadu government. If something happens here, or against West Bengal government, or against Punjab government, then our constitutional machinery will break down. Yes. There are serious problems relating to the Tamils' treatment in Sri Lanka, which has been there for the last 20-25 years. Everyone knows that in Sri Lanka there has been terrorist attack for 20-25 years by Prabhakaran. Prabhakaran destroyed people, Prabhakaran killed people mercilessly. He wanted to become another Saddam Hussein or somebody like that. So naturally, the Sri Lankan army wanted to get rid of it. But if atrocities have been committed in the process, they are definitely required to be looked into, and if there has been not collateral damage but deliberate atrocities, then the people should be punished as other people are being punished in the International Court of Justice. For that we should not raise such a big ruckus and start spoiling our relations, because India is exporting huge quantities of goods and services to Sri Lanka, and Tamil Nadu will suffer.
Okay.
Mostly the Tamil people will suffer because we are exporting a lot of things to Sri Lanka. So I think we should be more careful in regard to maintaining relations with Sri Lanka. And Pakistan, in any case, it's a difficult issue. Only today we have seen in the papers that Nawab Sharif says that we should improve relations with India, otherwise Pakistan is getting seriously affected. So everyone is realizing that neighborly relations have to be good. It cannot be, always on a position of razor edge or anything like that.
Okay, that's very good advice. Given what happened to MH70 and MH17, what are the likely changes that will come about due to these two incidents?
ICAO probably is already, International Civil Aviation Organization is already working on it. Technology is available to monitor every aircraft in flight. Technology is available to monitor even the engines which are there in the aircraft. There is a center Boeing which is probably running in London or somewhere close to London, by which they can monitor all engines of Boeing aircraft flying in the air, provided they have established that link. So technology is available to monitor every aircraft in flight. It's not difficult at all. But even after that, I am reasonably certain that the MH17 should have been flying across Ukraine. They would have been monitoring it. But if they get shot, you can't do anything about it. But you can only locate the plane, locate the aircraft. That's all you can do. Technology will permit you only to do that. Technology cannot permit you to stop somebody hijacking the aircraft in the air, or somebody from damaging the aircraft from the ground by a missile or anything.
What is your reading of what has happened to MH70?
MH70?
Yeah.
70.
70, sorry.
It's
yeah,
very
70.
difficult to say, because in all probability the pilot might have been bought out by one of the fundamentalists, because there is no other reason why an aircraft would go off the track and go into the sea. Why he did it? Because he's supposed to be a good man. He had no motive. He was not interested in money. There was no kidnapping. There was nothing. I mean, why he did it, nobody knows. Because it's very difficult to see on certain occasions, aircraft can develop major technical snags. Like for instance, some aileron fails, hydraulic system fails. But then if the hydraulic system fails, all the three hydraulic systems have to fail. Large aircraft have got three hydraulic systems.
Okay.
Two fails, one will still be there. And there is 1 in 10 million chance of them failing. And even if that failed, the pilot would have a time to radio back to his headquarters that he is in trouble. Nothing of this thing happened. Therefore, probably it could be only a hijack. That's all one can say by the pilot himself.
Okay. Finally, in a presentation held in a top think tank recently, your name was mentioned for the post of president of the BRICS Bank that is likely to start functioning soon. Casey's View Spot wishes you all the best in getting that post. How different would a BRICS Bank be as compared to the IMF and World Bank?
First of all, it's a joke, big joke. Everybody suggesting that. And
suggesting what?
Suggesting me as a president.
No, I really, it was really said in all seriousness.
No, it might have been said in seriousness, but I consider it a very big joke of the day. Now, as far as BRICS Bank is concerned, the idea is to probably be relaxed on the conditionalities imposed by IMF and World Bank, particularly in the minute interference in the minute administrative affairs of the countries concerned, which many countries were very, very angry with the IMF and World Bank, particularly in the Southeast Asian crisis and several other financial crises before. And I remember as Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund, our officers from the International Monetary Fund used to sit in the government headquarters and used to make presidents and prime ministers sign on the dotted line that you accept these conditionalities. Some of these conditionalities used to be very rigorous, 50 conditionalities, 60 conditionalities. You cannot run a government sitting in the IMF headquarters. And some of us used to protest very violently, particularly those who are coming from a country like India or some other country. We used to protest. He said you cannot force countries to cut down expenditure when people are starving. You have to provide them relief. None of them have ever seen relief works in their lifetime. Whereas I have seen relief works in my lifetime. Where I have done relief works when there was famine. So I used to protest in the IMF. Why are you doing this? Why are you asking Indonesia to cut down its fiscal deficit? They have to in fact increase expenditure. Ultimately, when everything failed, they came around and they said, no, increase expenditure to provide relief works. So this may be one of the reasons why that BRICS Bank has come up. There is also a proposal to start an Asian Monetary Fund by Japan and China. That was in 2001-2002. That was shot down by the United States and IMF. Still, it is functioning as a currency swap arrangement. Now they have got almost $240 billion through which they can have arrangements between two countries instead of approaching IMF or World Bank. So IMF and World Bank also must seriously consider reforming themselves because its institute is about 60-70 years old now. It's time that they reform. It's time they gave voice to India and China and Brazil and other countries which have got GDP of a very high order. So I think this is a reaction to the domination of the Western country. For example, take Belgium. Belgium had more voting strength than India. Belgium is not even as big as Malapur. But it had the voting power. Similarly, small countries, they had larger voting power than any other country. The formula itself, which determined the voting power, was squared and in their favor. So now I think they are going to have a relook, but the United States is not agreeing.
The world has changed so much in 60,
Even
70
in
years.
2010, the IMF embarked on a major reform. They changed the whole process of election. They said there will be no more permanent executive directors. India is not a permanent executive, it always gets elected. They said all executive directors are elected. 2 posts will have to be given up by the European Union countries. They reduce the voting strength of the United States. But the United States has not done anything. They have not passed a legislation approving all that. So therefore still people feel the US and the Western countries want to be dominant in these institutions. That is why it has given birth to BRICS. And there may be an IMF also, Asian Monetary Fund.
So let's hope we have this BRICS Bank and this
it is there. The BRICS Bank is there.
That it starts functioning soon. Thank you very much, Mr. Sivaraman, for answering a whole range of comprehensive questions. We hope you can appear in KC's Blue Spot as and when opportunity presents itself.
Thank you very much.
I
hope this is very useful.